evening. This is the India Development Debate right here on ET Now. I'm Supriya Srinath, and Finance Minister Arun Jaitley clearly is an angry man. As back-to-back bank scams keep roiling finance and equity markets, the Finance Minister used the ET Global Business Summit to express his displeasure over India Inc.'s lack of ethics in dealing with public money. Not stopping there, Jaitley also hit out at the regulator, stating that the Indian system, although politicians are accountable, the regulators often go scot-free. In an exclusive chat with the Economic Times, he said that the entire effort of ease of doing business goes into the background if scams like this happen at regular intervals. Talking about bad loans, which would have been plaguing the Indian banking system, Jaitley says it is important to understand that much of it is due to business failures and how much it is the result of frauds. Bank managements have not been spared either. The Finance Minister says if frauds are happening through multiple branches and still the bank has no clue, there is something amiss when it comes to surveillance systems. Remember, this is the first detailed comment from the Finance Minister on the big bank scam involving Nirav Modi, Mehul Choksi and Vikram Kothari. The big ethical dilemma for India Inc. That's our topic of discussion tonight. And before we begin our debate, let's first hear out Finance Minister Arun Jaitley.
The Indian businesses have to realize that it has to be the habit of doing ethical business, which is something which now I think needs to be introduced, and those who deviate from that course must always remember that the consequences will not only be a commercial and a civil death as far as their businesses are concerned, but the law would be tightened further if necessary in order to find out where they are and what is the extreme action that law permits against such delinquent persons itself. The bank frauds which have now come to surface. Now, if you periodically have incidents of this kind, I think the entire effort of ease of doing business itself goes into the background. And therefore, it is these cards on the economy which take the front seat. You see, ultimately, if a fraud is taking place in multiple branches of banking system and you don't have a single employee who raises the red flag, doesn't that become worrisome for the country as a whole?
Sure.
And similarly, if you had the top managements who were indifferent to what was going on or either unaware of what was going on, you had at least multiple layers of auditing system which chose to either look the other way or did a casual job. And you had an inadequate supervision right on top from the supervisory agencies itself. And therefore, I think who did what will eventually be found out only in the course of whatever inquiries are on. But it does create a worrisome situation. Regulators have a very important function. Regulators ultimately decide the rules of the game. And the regulators have to have a third eye which is perpetually to be open. And which must keep looking at the sector. But unfortunately, in Indian system, we politicians are accountable, the regulators are not.
All right, that's a hard-hitting statement all the way from the Economic Times Global Business Summit from the Finance Minister himself. Let's take it straight across to this wonderful panel that's joining us right here on the India Development Debate this evening. I've got Naushad Forbes, former President CII and Co-Chairman Forbes, Marshall V. Anant Nageshwaran, independent consultant, Vanside Consulting, M.R. Venkatesh, political analyst, Narendra Taneja representing the BJP, and Gaurav Vallabh representing the Congress party. So thanks each one of you for being with us. And Mr. M.R. Venkatesh, if only I may begin with you. Mr. Finance Minister says very categorically that the regulator needs to have a third eye to keep a tab on scams of this nature to be able to crack down upon that. But is the Finance Minister justified in slamming the banking sector regulator, which is the RBI, for failing to detect a fraud of this nature? Did the RBI, according to you, slip in its supervision?
Supriya, I would tell you, since I passed my chartered accountancy, I have seen at least mega scams in the banking sector, beginning the Harshad Mehta scam. He was baptized as a chartered accountant when the Harshad Mehta scam broke out. Till date, I have not seen a single officer of RBI ever being hauled up for incompetency or being hand in glove or whatever. RBI immediately takes the pole position and tries to in fact become the investigating agency whenever the fraud happens. On the contrary, a fraud by within the banking system by default points out a laxity or complicity by RBI. By definition, a banking fraud is a regulatory fraud. In our country, we invariably blame the bankers. Of course, they have to be blamed and hang them if they have to be. But RBI is holier than holiest of cows. Sorry, I am one of those who believe a banking fraud is a regulatory fraud, period. And for the finance minister to say that RBI should have a third eye, I am sorry, RBI genetically doesn't have within it to have the third eye. So that begs the question, why isn't the government helping it with a third eye? Now what is required in this country is some sort of an organization like the Intelligence Bureau. We require an Economic Intelligence Bureau, EIB, some sort of it which gathers information for the government, not working as a regulator, not working as some sort of an investigator, but more as some sort of a informant to the government and collect all these type of information. And I'll just close with my opening remarks with only one thing. See, Nirav Modi was seen with the Prime Minister in Davos on 23rd January, and the system was oblivious to a fact that here was a man who was a fraudster. The entire system was sleeping when Nirav Modi was seen in Davos. What was PMO doing? What was IB doing? What was RBI doing? All of them were sleeping, and the fraud exploded 7 or 8 days later. Now look at it. This is something very, very serious. And this shows the RBI doesn't have within it. RBI is, I'm sorry to say, 20 years behind the curve in terms of understanding what is happening in the banking sector to be its regulator. We require a totally new body, an Economic Information Bureau, or some sort of, call it by whatever name you may, but something which goes behind all these transactions and keeps a more than a watchdog position, tries to take a hawkish position, tries to gather various type of economic intelligence, and then tries to use big data, tries to use technology and go after the big cheats.
No, I get your point there, and I get your angst as well, but important opening comments there as far as the RBI being behind the curve is concerned, or even as far as this Economic Intelligence Bureau is concerned. Those are good suggestions, and we'll debate and discuss that over the next 60 minutes or so. But Anant Nageshwaran, the fact that the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister have made statements on the failure of the supervisor, obviously not naming the RBI, but the supervisor we all know for the banking space is the regulator, is the RBI. The signal is clear. They want to convey their displeasure. Now, what should the RBI be doing at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, RBI's Deputy Governor, Mr. Mundra, in 2016 has already made this point about transactions being authorized through SWIFT, etc. So, to that extent, RBI was aware of this, and there have been failures of audit at multiple levels: internal audit, statutory audit. Is a little bit too complicated. I think between the government and the RBI, this process of fixing the lacuna must happen somewhat not in public space, but I think privately, because here in general, let's keep RBI and the government out. Let's think of it as a corporate fraud. Usually when a corporate fraud occurs, the onus goes from the management to the board to the owner, and then comes the statutory authorities. So the management is appointed by the government, the board is pretty much dominated by the government, and the owner is the government. So the onus normally falls on these three first before it falls on the regulator. So I would have preferred if this discussion between the RBI and the government had happened privately rather than in the public space, because this is not going to help in resolving the issue, because there are situations when the RBI has not as much of an authority to supervise public sector banks as it has over the private sector banks. The government does not need RBI's approval to appoint the chairman and managing director, whereas private sector banks have to be approved by the RBI. The playing field is not level in some sense. So therefore, yes, RBI is definitely responsible, given that this has been going on for 7 years, etc. But I'm not so sure that this helps to resolve the issue if these differences and disappointments are aired in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess differences and disappointments should not be aired in public, but this is a very, very high-profile public case, and I think it's time in India that we talk about these things openly. You know, whoever is responsible is brought to book. But Naushad Forbes, you know, we've discussed and debated the displeasure that the finance minister and the prime minister has been able to convey. I will at a later stage talk about where does the buck really stop? Does it stop at North Block? Does it stop at Mint Street? I'll discuss that in a while from now. But you know what, the finance minister did condemn the role of auditors and the role of RBI. The question that he raised is that politicians are accountable in India, but regulators go scot-free. They are not accountable. Do you believe he is justified in saying so, simply because at the end of the day, it's actually the politicians who face the fire of a fraud?
Well, I'm not sure when you say that politicians face the fire of fraud. I'm not sure that's entirely correct. Let me make 3 quick points. First of all, you know that when any such fraud happens, it's an opportunity to actually identify gaps in the system. In this case, there were issues with the management of the bank concerned. There were issues under which these LOCs were issued. There were issues with oversight within the bank itself in terms of the bank violating norms and internal norms. And there were issues where the regulator then, the RBI, tightened up the norms, said that there needed to be certain things that were followed, which were actually not followed by the bank. So the regulator actually did not, it issued the necessary corrective measures, but it did not follow up to ensure that those corrective measures were actually implemented by the bank. So there was a failure on the part of the regulator. There was a bigger failure on the part of the bank management. And I do want to then make 2 additional points. First, that at the end of the day, whenever such a fraud comes to light concerning a firm, who do we normally, including in the media, when we do these trial by media programs, who do we look at first? We look at the promoters. In this case, who's the promoter? The promoter is the government, right? Who's the owner? The owner is the government of the bank. So why aren't we looking also at the promoter, looking also at the owner and saying, what's the responsibility here? At the end of the day, as was pointed out just now, it's the government that appoints the board of the bank. It's the government that appoints the chairman of the bank. As a result, there is a direct responsibility to ensure that that chairman, ensure that that management of the bank, and ensure that the bank provides the right kind of oversight, that the auditors are playing their part, and that the regulator is playing their part as well, and that necessary correctives are indeed being implemented effectively. So I do think that there is a very direct responsibility that the government faces as owner. The last point that I'd make is that this is where we should take an opportunity to actually do things to clean up the banking system once and for all that we've not done, which is to go ahead with bank privatization. For years and years and years, we've had this sort of holy grail that no, we can't drop below 50% public ownership of banks. With what objective? Somehow it's in the public interest. That means it's somehow in the public interest to have these kinds of frauds, to have powerful individuals with friends in high places who can get away with whatever. I mean, this is what the public ownership of banks has resulted in. So I think we should address that core issue of public ownership of banks, which will address the issue in turn of how much people are paid at management and lower levels in banks, which will remove the incentive to go in for these kinds of deals that are done that actually are the foundation for a lot of the fraud that happens. And you can get rid of once and for all the kind of onus that exists between public ownership, political influence, and I think, a somewhat ineffective banking system as a result.
Right.
It's not that fraud doesn't happen in private sector banks, but when fraud happens in private sector banks, it's the shareholders that face the brunt of it.
Right.
In this case, it's the taxpayer that bears the brunt of it.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more on this, but I think you bring an important point to the table that the promoter of PNB is who? It's the Government of India, and shouldn't the buck stop with them? Naren Taneja, while the Finance Minister is justified in raising questions on auditors, he's perhaps also justified in questioning the regulator and wanting the regulator to have a third eye to detect a fraud like that. But doesn't the buck stop with the elected government of the day that's answerable to Parliament? And in this case, the government that's also the majority owner of PNB.
Well, if you doesn't want to do the homework, that's the best way to do. Easy, you know, just say blame government for everything, bad weather, accident, fraud, and whatever, just because the organization happens to be such where the government has majority stake. You see, the government has majority stake, you know, but Punjab National Bank in this particular case, you know, is a company, is a business establishment, you know, governed by business laws of the country and by registrar of company and so on and so forth. It's also listed. Government doesn't own it 100%, and at the same time, if the government starts intervening on day-to-day affairs from branch to branch to branch to branch, you know, the same people will be the first one to say, hey, look at the government, what the government is doing. And if the government says, we're just trying to make sure there's no fraud, they will go after the government too. Again, so the question is that here is a business establishment where a fraud has taken place. And day-to-day affairs in a branch in Bombay, in a part of Bombay, so there's a bank, first the bank management is responsible for it, they have their own vigilance, they have their own audit system and all that, and everything is basically, you know, governed by a regulator called, in this case, the Reserve Bank of India. Now the question here is that, you know, how do we make sure that, you know, how do we make sure that such things don't happen? But the point here is that what many people have done, including a section of media and of course a politician, they started with the easiest thing is not to look at the whole thing, that is not realizing fraud is a fraud, but going and targeting the Prime Minister in some cases directly. Now, I think I personally feel the government may own majority stake, but these organizations are and must be and should be basically, you know, be independent entities governed by their own laws, their own audit, and once you have a regulator, regulators' jobs come in.
Right. Yeah. Okay, Mr. Taneja, you put a point on the table that once the regulator is there, the regulator is the one that sets the rules of the game for the sector, and that is when their job needs to come in, despite the fact that the government is a majority owner. I get your point. I may not appreciate it, but I still get your point. Gaurav Vallabh, I know that the Congress party has for long been trying to attack the government on this, that the government cannot be blaming the regulator, it's the government's responsibility. But just to be the devil's advocate, what about the role of the regulators? If the buck doesn't stop with the regulator, who's supposed to set the rules of the game there, who's supposed to supervise the sector, then what is the point of being autonomous and independent? Those are very, very important words. And if those important words are going to be a part of your mandate, then, you know, the buck can't not stop with you.
See, Supriya, ruler is saying that I am not responsible, regulator is going to be responsible. So, ruler is putting responsibility to regulator. And I would like to share with you, in any company, Punjab National Bank is a company. So, in any company, the highest decision making body is the board. And in this case, in Punjab National Bank, there are 10 directors. I am asking you, is any director out of those 10 is appointed by public at large or by government? You will be surprised to know, and that is the reality of the day, that all directors are appointed by government, and government is saying that I am not going to be responsible, the regulator is going to be responsible, they have to put their third eye. My second question is that when regulator is busy and you made the regulator busy because of your haphazard decisions of counting and printing the currency, what supervisory role they can take? They are busy in last 2 years in printing and counting the currency. So what supervision?
There are dedicated departments within the RBI to take care of the banking regulation. What are you talking about?
I am coming to that, Supriya. I'm coming to that. That dedicated department, for your information, Supriya, is headed by a deputy governor level person, and for last 7 months it is headless.
That's a valid point.
A department which is not having any leadership, and you expect that department is going to do anything. The board is yours, and you are saying that Reserve Bank is going to take. This type of political patronage politically preserved frauds, how it can happen that 11,400 crore a person flies without government intimation?
I get that. Mr. Gaurav Vallabh, I'm sorry, we can't waste any more time.
Every time.
Mr. Gaurav Vallabh, I get your point. You will continue to blame the government. The government will continue to blame the RBI. I don't know where the truth lies. I get your point, but I also want to shift the focus. Mr. Vallabh, I will come back to you for another question. No, sir. No, I will come back to you for another question. I want to cover more ground. Mr. Vallabh, I will come back to you. Be rest assured, I always give you a chance to speak on my shows. Please be rest assured, Mr. Vallabh, I will not let you continue because I have to move on to another part of my debate. And that debate has to do with Indian industry. Mr. M.R. Venkatesh, the finance... Mr. Vallabh, you can't carry on if I'm talking, right? Please keep quiet. I'll come back to you for another part of the debate. We can't waste 30 minutes on the debate only talking about RBI versus the government. The other part of this debate is Indian industry, and the finance minister is perhaps right to point out that ethics have been done away with certain sections of the Indian industry. Mr. M.R. Venkatesh, do you believe sections of Indian industry, sections of corporate India have taken public money for a ride, have taken public money for granted, those who have gamed the system and they're coming by dime a dozen?
Supriya, I think this is a no-brainer. The ethics level in corporate India, especially the higher levels, in certain sections, not all, definitely in certain sections, is lacking. And I can tell you that the quality of audit, especially large firms where I know personally, have employed children of certain IAS officers, of RBI officers, and that is how the whole system and whole process is getting gamed. Now it is everybody knows it, but there is nobody who takes the system by the bull by the horns. Nobody wants to go and dynamite the system because they know once you start questioning these type of things, the whole system will collapse. Ideally, between the Congress and the BJP, if really there is going to be some consensus, I think the whole demand of the Congress should be that the BJP government must sack the entire RBI board. For starters, if a honest investigation has to happen, CIA must demand this, Asocham must demand this. I think RBI board today stands completely exposed, and if Mr. Arun Jaitley is going to blame the RBI but not do anything more than blaming the RBI, I think he is not walking the talk. So there is a trust deficit, there is a ethics deficit all across, whether it is the audit profession, whether it is the regulator profession, whether it is the business profession. So we need to first go to the root of it, and the root of it is that punishment is made mandatory. And if regulators don't get punished and they hide themselves well in all their circulars and all the rules and all the regulations, I think we are going to go nowhere. We will have yet another Nirav Modi, and I'm sure there are dime a dozen Nirav Modi across the length and breadth of banking India in this scam of LOUs. So the point is that we need to go to the bottom of the matter and take very hard steps.
Fair point indeed, but your hard steps also perhaps need to be taken by the other stakeholder, and that is Indian industry. Let me ask Naushad Forbes, always a very candid speaking man, has also taken pot shots as his own community, his own tribe when it needed. And Mr. Forbes, Dr. Forbes actually, does it raise questions on how business is being done in India? Rules are being bent, ethic has been set aside, case after case is bringing to light how ethics are being compromised. Does it raise questions on how business is being conducted in this country?
So, thank you for the introduction to that question. I believe very strongly that the responsibility for ethics in business starts with business. It is for us in industry to clean up our own act. There are many, many companies, many thousands and thousands of companies that do business in a perfectly ethical, principled way and do things in the national interest. And then there are a few bad companies that violate norms, that exploit loopholes, that take advantage of relationships, that bribe people, and that do business in a manner which brings the entire sector and the entire Indian industry into disrepute. That's what we're very concerned about. We did last year in CI have a very strong initiative which continues this year on ethics. where companies voluntarily come forward and sign a code of ethics. And I think we have a list on our CII website of companies that have signed the code of ethics, and I would recommend that you look at that list and look at which companies on that list are on that list. And I would ask you also to look at which companies are not on that list and ask those companies in your own discussions why they aren't. Because I think we do need to clean up our own act and ensure that we operate as industry should operate, as responsible, ethical members of society. But I do want to come back to this point on bank relationships. The problem with bank relationships and with public sector bank relationships, why is it that it is public sector banks where we see these scams happening? It is because they are public sector banks, because you have political interference. And let me say that this is not, I do not hold the government of the day responsible for the Punjab National Bank fraud. Neither do I hold the previous government responsible for the Punjab National Bank fraud. I hold the basic institutional structure that Punjab National Bank is a public sector bank. We need to move away from this. We need to move to privatization of the banks and then hold the banks squarely responsible for their results, and then leave it to the banks to actually run their affairs as they should, with no political interference, because as majority private-owned banks, there can be no political interference or they will go bust.
Absolutely.
The Reserve Bank of India, on the other hand, has to be a public sector bank, has to indeed continue to be a public sector and 100% country-owned, national-owned enterprise. And I don't agree with the point made earlier about the board of the Reserve Bank needing to be sacked, etc. Does the Reserve Bank need to tighten up on some of its regulations to ensure implementation? Yes, it does.
Okay,
but I think we need to punish wrongdoing and punish criminality. We shouldn't punish things that go wrong by error.
I think I will thank you once again for being at least candid and saying sections of Indian industry being disrepute by indulging in wrong practices. But Arun Jaitley, the finance minister, has threatened the industry with quote-unquote dire consequences if it deviates from ethical business. But do you believe it's the low rate of white-collar crime conviction that makes this an empty threat? Do you believe people have been able to game the system, people don't take this seriously? Because the rate of conviction for financial crimes or for financial irregularities is so pathetic, is just so low. So this sounds like an empty threat at the end of it.
That's a good question, but I wouldn't say this government has been issuing empty threats in this matter, because the tax administration, if anything, has become a lot more coercive in the last several years. Of course, it started in the middle of the last decade, 2004-05, and it has become stronger. So it may not, we may not see convictions that requires, proof in a court of law, etc. And Indian court systems take time. So I can't say that there is it's an empty threat simply because we haven't had conviction. Well, we haven't had convictions on a great scale even in the West, where these systems operate much better. I'm not so sure that all of this are fraudulent practices, simply because between 2002 and 2010, every year the Indian economy beat the consensus growth forecast. So optimism was very much in the air that India had gone on to a much higher growth path. So yes, there are frauds, but some of the non-performing assets, etc., are also due to the fact that there has been excessive optimism on India's growth rate. So what I mean, honest project revenue calculations that went awry. So the issue is, as you correctly put it in one of your previous questions, there is an ethics and credibility deficit. Look at the news story about Indian importers not taking delivery of pulses from overseas because local prices have crashed. They are refusing to take consignment on delivery and refusing to sign the import documents. This is not this is just a symptomatic of the overall ethics and credibility deficit, and it is not so much a question of whether there is conviction taking place or not.
Right. Just to quickly ask this question to M.R. Venkatesh before I go back to the politicians, and Mr. Venkatesh, what kind of changes need to be made to the lender-borrower laws to ensure that the system isn't taken for a ride? I mean, how does government ensure that the guilty are really brought to book in record time. If I was just to point out how it's being gamed right now, the promoters are obviously, and this is an open secret, the promoters inflate project costs to access higher routes of credit. That goes into the promoter kitty. It perhaps also goes for political funding. How should the government change it? How should the government check this modus operandi of inflating project costs and getting bankers and in turn taxpayers to foot this bill? How does one crack down upon this modus operandi really?
Get better information, use technology, get access to big data, have some centralized information system that takes care of all sorts of warning signals, all sorts of red flags are scrutinized. Lastly, we must have criminal courts where the judges are equipped to understand commerce and penalize the deviant. Unfortunately, you have a pickpocket, you have a rape case, and then you also have a banking fraud case in a criminal court. This doesn't work, and we don't have the fear of law. We don't have the fear of law at any point in time. As you very rightly said, probably the conviction in any criminal trial will be around 7 or 8%. And if this is going to be the final, and look at CBI, the best of the investigation that goes on in banking frauds is done by CBI. And how many CBI officers are competent to understand something like a derivative? How many of these officers understand shares? How many of them understand bank credit? So these are all systemic issues, and these cannot be addressed overnight. But somewhere down the line, you have to have a comprehensive answer to all this. We have been breastbeating this for the last 70 years. But somewhere down the line, somebody has to say reforms in the financial sector regulation, period. We have to have a complete overhaul of these regulations and say what we needs to be done. For starters, banking regulation by RBI, I stand by my word, though my co-panelists had a different view. I think this RBI board has to at least step down on moral grounds, if not on legal grounds. They have to step down. Otherwise, we are sending a very wrong signal to the entire economy.
All right. But let me just turn focus and let's talk about some legislations that are perhaps going to see the light of day to crack down upon financial irregularities, to crack down upon crimes and people who flee the country after perpetrating something like that. Mr. Narendra Reja, how will the government walk the talk on the Prime Minister's quote-unquote strict action that he spoke at the Economic Times GBS against those engaging in financial manipulation? Do you believe that the new fugitive bill, which is in the works, that aims to help confiscate assets of high-value economic offenders absconding from India till they submit to jurisdiction of the appropriate legal forum, be able to fix this? I mean, I know it is it's perhaps a step in the right direction, but do you believe this is going to be a deterrent? Do you believe this is going to be able to fix the problem? Perpetrators of crime do a crime, flee the land, and we are left with minions to question and carry forward.
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. If you say it will fix 100%, we don't know. But the government is definitely going to do what the government has talked about. Absolutely, no doubt about it. We'll try our level best, to do that. The question, as we have been discussing, and some of my co-panelists have talked about it, the question, Supriya, is of ethics in general and ethics in corporate India in particular. The fact is, we know that, we all know about gold plating. We all know there are people, they come and they're in the past gone to the banks, borrowed money, and then the companies in the process have grown weak, but they personally, individually, in the meantime, they were also, acquired passport of Singapore or Ireland and all that, but they have grown rich. If you look at the personal wealth of these industrialists, some of them, they are actually grown much richer than what they were when they started their business. Now the question is that how do we address and check these things? A person who doesn't own Indian passport any longer, why should that person be actually allowed to sit there in the cockpit of the company or to borrow more money and so on and so forth? So I think the ethics is one thing that we need to work on very seriously. Ethics in general. And I think, that's a social issue, I know that. But at the same time, we need to think about it, that how do we do that? And, in my previous avatar, I was a journalist and focusing more on corporates, practically all of them in India. And I know what happens there. Many of these people, some of them had actually gone for restructuring. We know that personally in Singapore, Ireland, elsewhere, they are actually billionaires and they live like kings. So now at the cost
that's
of
precisely the point.
India's taxpayers. So we got to stop it. Now Ethics, as far as concerned, the social, so just a second, last line. As far as the social thing is concerned, I think it's important to identify such people, expose them, and also declare them social outcasts at the same time.
Fair point indeed. I think you're absolutely right. Somebody who perpetrates a crime flees this country, can't be living like a king somewhere else, and the case just carries on. But Gaurav Vallabh, I'll ask you a candid question. At least Naren Taneja was candid to say it may not fix 100% of the problem, it will fix at least some part of this. Will the Congress party support this legislation if it were to be brought in the second half of the budget session that resumes from the 5th of March?
Yeah, definitely we are always open for the forward-looking legislations, but I want to point out 2-3 points. First point, that why don't you have a professionalism in the bank's board? Why all political party sympathizers are on the board? Why don't we make a provision that a person who belongs to a political party can't enter into any PSU's board? That is my first suggestion. Second, for example, if somebody is anybody who is having 1,000 crore or more exposure on any bank, can't we have a passport which required ECR or some system that for any foreign travel the immigration check is required, so that we can control all those things? Third thing, the way the digitization is happening in the financial market, so every bank should have now a new department, which I will call that as a technical watchdog department, because our risk management practices across the banks, because I worked in lot many institutions and I know what's the risk management practices. The risk management practices across the banks are only focusing on credit and market risk. Operational risk is altogether absent, and we only used to provide a capital for the operational risk. But now operational risk, which talks about people, process and system, is taking a front lead. So why don't we have a technical watchdog only for operational risk? Because now the way systems are their use is increasing, the people's interference is increasing, and the processes I would like to say, Supriya, the processes in all public sector banks requires a pure BPR. There should be restructuring required in all processes, not only this, all credit processes also, because those processes had not seen the light of the technological intervention in the industry.
No, absolutely. And I'm at least glad that at this point in time, at least the politicians are putting solutions to the table and not just taking political jabs. And you're right, technological intervention is required, and the RBI cannot be 20 years behind the curve, like M.R. Venkatesh had said earlier in the show. But I think we'll take a really quick breather here. We come back and discuss what does all this clampdown really do to investments? Will this perhaps going to deter investments? Or is this something that the industry is invited upon himself? We're back in a moment. Please do stay with us. My wonderful panel, I'm back in 2 minutes, and we'll carry forward with this very fascinating debate. So good to be back with all of you right here on the India Development Debate on ET Now, and I'm going to carry things forward very quickly with just the two politicians before I go any further. And actually, I'll just take a quick question with Anand Nageshwaran before I go any further with the politicians. And Anand Nageshwaran, what about action against PNB? I mean, there were these things in the corridors of power about a PCA that has not been initiated. We have perhaps been just left at the whims and fancies of a bunch of agencies that are trying to establish criminality here. But what about corrective action against a bank? Is that long overdue?
Well, I suppose the only corrective action which the government has kind of indicated earlier is to make sure that capital replenishment is given only to those banks that show improvement in their risk management, in ensuring prevention of non-performing assets, etc. And that includes both frauds and risk assessment. So definitely, I think as people here have been saying, accountability has to spread across management and the owner, which is the government, in which case the government has to think of whether it can change the ownership patterns in public sector banks, etc. But privatization may not be the answer. But to answer your question, yes, the Punjab National Bank management and the board, as well as the auditors, there needs to be accountability so that people know that there are consequences to negligence, even if it is not a fraud, but sheer oversight negligence has to be taken into consideration. So the answer is yes.
And Aja, I'll ask you a little bit of an uncomfortable question there. The Bank Board Bureau that was set up by this government, and the former CAG Vinod Roy was, is a celebrated man, was brought in and all of that, that had suggested the government separate the management function of the board from its supervisory function. Now, why were steps like these not paid heed to? Why were these not implemented? And even on the fugitive law, why was this law not thought about when Vijay Mallya fled the country and made a mockery of all of us? Why are we making these knee-jerk reactions now? Couldn't this have come before?
No, this is not knee-jerk reaction. You see, the point is there are many suggestions on the table, and you can understand in the kind of, size we are talking about. So these things have to be studied very carefully. Different ministries need to be involved. But that's what the government is, planning to do. Because that's what I have said I've said at least 3 different channels. And my friend from the Congress party has taken away that idea from me. By the way, just remind him, it's my copyright on that. Because I'm saying that, last several days, I'm saying that the politicians should not be sitting on public sector enterprises boards. Why should politicians be there? I mean, it's my personal view, but I'm saying it repeatedly in different channels. And he was participating with me another channel 2 days back, and I said the same thing. He's just taken it from there. The point is that we need to basically bring about those kind of things so that there is a kind of insulate. So these enterprises may be owned by the government, but they are quite independent. But as far as your suggestions, recommendations, there are so many others on the table, and we are committed. When you look at our track record since we came to, we are committed to make sure all these enterprises, including banks, are professionally run. And if something goes wrong, they will be held responsible.
Naren Taneja, you have a very good suggestion that politicians should not be sitting on the boards of public sector enterprises. I hope you're going to tell this to your co-spokesperson from the BJP, Zafar Islam, Shazia Almi, and of course Samit Patra, to resign from the boards of companies that they're sitting on. But that's a point well taken, that the politicians should not be on the boards of these companies. They have no business being there. They don't bring the expertise. But let me turn focus to Gaurav Vallabh. And Gaurav Vallabh, hasn't this government demonstrated its intent of a crackdown by at least by at least arresting Vipul Ambani? I mean, who would have thought that a man with a surname like Ambani related to Dhirubhai would have been arrested? So at least the government is showing its intent of a crackdown. Gaurav Vallabh, are you going to deny that?
Supriya, I am just asking, Vipul Ambani is just an employee of that organization. By arresting that, can you recover a single penny? See, we want that public money which was looted under the political patronage, that should come back to the country. So by arresting Vipul Ambani, anything is coming extra? I am asking you. It may be for future you might be setting some examples that okay, in future CFOs. अरे भैया हमको बोलने तो दीजिए. अरे आप, whenever I am saying anything you interfere. You say this is my statement. I am speaking this for 20 years. You are saying this is my statement. So I am saying, madam, that by arresting Vipul Ambani, is any extra money coming back to the country? I am asking. So this is just diversion strategy, like private. I was listening, a lot of experts were saying converting public banks to private sector banks. I am asking one thing, based on the data, the 87% of the credit in our country is given by the public sector bank, and their share in the NPA is not much different than 87%. So what is the logic of this? Try to strengthen the system, try to remove the political patronage and have the economy revolving, so that the genuine defaulters should not come. So for willful defaulters, have the system, have the fear, and
Gaurav Vallabh, it's important to privatize the public sector banks because it brings about a lot of transparency. The government has no business being the majority owner and sitting and prescribing and subscribing over these scams. I get your larger point there on the one that you were trying to make about Vipul Ambani just being an employee and what is he going to, what is he going to bring to the table. But the fact is that he is related to a very, very big business family in the country, and it was unthinkable of as far as arrest was concerned. But Naushad, folks, let's shift the focus back to the implications of the scam. The finance minister is talking tough. The Prime Minister is talking very
At
tough.
least
They are trying to show the rule book to the regulators. They're telling India ink on ethics. But do you believe at one level the PNB fraud has scarred the reform narrative and has pushed ease of doing business to the background? In fact, we are even given to understand that the government is looking to restrict foreign travel of promoters of defaulting companies and scrutinize abnormal increase in overseas transactions. Now, while all of that is perhaps welcome and warranted when you have these repeated scams, but how feasible will this be to implement, and does it also not mean excessive intrusion of the state?
So I do believe that the longer term narrative of the Indian economy has to be one of reform if we're going to progress and achieve the potential that we have as a country. And I do think that we shouldn't lose sight of where we have to go overall as a country, which is to move to a lighter state, to a state which is less intrusive, to a state which relies more on trust, to a state which is less involved in regulation, and certainly to a state which is less involved in running companies. So I do think that has to be the longer term narrative of the economy over time. Now, what do we need to do here and now? I think we should take advantage, let me use the word again, advantage of scams like this to clean up things. What do we need to do to actually clean up things? Our immediate reaction when we hear about a scam is we want revenge. We want to catch the bad guys. We want to punish someone. Let's focus instead on what are the structural changes needed in the system such that the scams cannot recur or that fewer scams recur, right? And if we're going to do that, that's where I'll come back to the same point again about privatization. Indira Gandhi was wrong to nationalize banks in 1969, and Narendra Modi would be right to privatize banks in 2018. And I think we should keep coming back to that point. Let's go ahead with privatization of banks. It will raise a lot of funds for the banks and then get the government out of running things they have no business running. This is true for the banks. It's even more true for other companies. You know, you talked about investment and what impact will this have on investment. If we keep trying to control initiative, if we keep trying to regulate what entrepreneurs do, if we keep trying to inspect and regulate and threaten honesty into entrepreneurs, we will not succeed as a country. We will instead succeed the same way in which we have succeeded since 1991, by letting honest entrepreneurs prosper instead of those with connections and crony capitalists, by letting entrepreneurs who invest in sensible projects prosper, and not only rewarding but recognizing them for their contribution to the country. And I think we should keep coming back to that it is the honest who should prosper, and in the process of prospering displace the dishonest. That's the kind of society we need, not a society where we spend all our time saying, how do we catch and punish the dishonest? What went wrong here? Some action is needed. The government must do something. Someone made the comment earlier, they should even do something about the weather.
Right. Yeah. No, you're right there, and you know, half jest, but I think that's so right. But Anant Nageshwaran, businesses obviously will now be scanned far more. Compliances will go up by banks, hopefully. Defaulters will be washed like a hall. Rules will be tightened for fugitives. But won't all of this result in further trust erosion between the government on one hand and the industry on another? And you know, will it not further impact investments? Won't this further delay that virtuous cycle of investment to pick up? Or do you believe it's all right if that happens?
No, I think that's a very valid concern you have, because capital formation has been affected in this country over the last several years, and to a large extent I think regulatory uncertainty and a culture of vindictiveness is there. But as we said, we have technology to zero in on the wrongdoers without sort of going after the entire tribe of business people just because a few people are taking advantage of the system. So you're absolutely right, that is an important concern, and I think the more we create an atmosphere of fear, and because we need to pander to the headlines and the need for finding the wolf so that the people will be satisfied. I think that is a risk that we could go overboard. I think more targeted approach, at the same time making it easy to create a pro-competitive environment as opposed to a pro-business environment. We need to separate all this and pursue them with the rational mind rather than with an emotional mind as to find villains here. That shouldn't be the focus of public policy.
MR Venkatesh, we'll let you have the last word on this. You know, while we don't have to have the mindset of trying to find the villains, but, you know, we really have to have a different mindset. But in a lot of ways, has the industry invited this upon itself by resorting to bend rules, by resorting to game the system over and over again? Yes, a section of the industry, but the industry has invited this upon itself.
Obviously, you can't blame the government now for doing what it knows best, ushering in more laws and regulations, and then you say that the ease of doing business is going down in this country. Obviously, we have not walked the talk as far as the industry is concerned. They have not walked the talk. And all this corporate governance, I have been a great advocate of corporate governance at a theoretical level, but I have also been a fair critic of the corporate governance as it practiced in corporate India, because I know many of these things get brushed below the carpet, and there is no way, there is no mechanism for the government to actually probe into all these activities of corporates. So now even the banks board are not having competent people and people with ethics. That is the biggest problem that we are facing today. So to clean the system, we require a complete overhaul of the entire financial regulatory regime. We just simply cannot put Tweedledum and try to replace him with Tweedledee. That's not going to be the answer. We have to look at the systemic change, and the systemic changes have to be at very large macro level decisions, like whether government should hold equity in the banks, and if so, to what extent. How will the banks run, and whether it will have professionals, whether professionals, even if they are hardcore professionals, whether if they have links with political parties, whether they can be inside the board. These are all very significant questions. We don't have an answer at this point in time. We need to debate these things, and probably if we find an answer to all this conundrum, 11,500 crores is worth the deal.
No, absolutely. I can't thank my wonderful panel enough, Mr. M.R. Venkatesh, Mr. Naushad Forbes, Mr. Anant Nageshwaran, Naren Taneja and Gaurav Vallabh for being with us. We've been able to put together some solutions on the table. This is a debate that will carry on. The government is talking tough. The government is now throwing the court ball in the court of the regulator. But the reality is that as far as conviction rates in India are concerned, those are very low. And I think Indian industry has some soul searching to do as well. Ethics of doing business cannot be completely done away with, and when that happens, you see a scam like this. There needs to be fear of law, there needs to be greater conviction rate in India, but most of all, the question really is, will more rules help that? Will more tweaking of rules help that? Or will a complete overhaul of the system really help that? That's the big question. We leave you with that thought. We'll be back with the same debate tomorrow at 9 p.m. on the India Development Debate this evening. Till then, thanks very much for being with us. Up next is Top 10 at 10 with Tanya Bharadwaj.